This is the survey of professional forecasters. It's from May 2021. So it's after all the fiscal stimulus is done, after you know how effective the vaccines are, when some of the variants are starting to rise. And the forecast for inflation in 2022, there was a greater probability put on a negative number, deflation, than there was on inflation above 4%. I think this error is arguably worse, not more consequential, but worse, more egregious than missing the financial crisis. Financial crises have, a multiple equilibria aspect to them. They have an efficient market's unpredictability aspect to them. Inflation doesn't normally just pop up from nowhere and go from 2 to 6. This should be something we can see and we can understand and we can predict. So I'm going to give you the model that was being used, and I'm going to be a little bit unfair and polemical, and then talk about how unfair and polemical I am. Want to understand, this forecasting miss, was it the right model, but there was an error term, or was it the wrong model, or the model misapplied? So here's the unfairly polemical exercise. We're going to give $1 million to each household. That's a fiscal stimulus, which is 514% of GDP. The multiplier is 0.8. Valerie, we can argue about the right number later. So GDP growth goes up 412%. I modeled this in terms of the unemployment rate. You get an unemployment rate of 0. And the Phillips curve has a slope of 0.15, so inflation rises to 2.6. Now we go out and actually observe the world. And real GDP might be 5% above baseline. It's hard for me to imagine that there's any policy that on a time horizon of less than a year could get you more than 5% above baseline. Inflation rises to 100%. And then people come along, try to understand this error, and they go out and observe that there's lots of ships lined up at the ports. The problem was clearly that the ports couldn't accept all the ships that wanted to come in for all the stuff that people wanted to buy with the $1 million that they were all given. So how unfair and polemical is that? The fiscal stimulus in the United States, these are numbers from Hong and Debbie Lucas, fresh off a BPA paper that they presented recently, adding up the fiscal credit and forbearance. The United States was about 25% of GDP. Germany, of the economies they looked at, was at the other end of the spectrum, 16, but everyone was really large. Let's now think about the model that was used was just what I said. This is IHS Markit. They used something sort of like Forbes and the Fed's model. After the US fiscal stimulus, the last 10% of GDP was introduced, they raised their growth forecast from 4 to 5.7. They did not change their inflation forecast, and they said that's because their Phillips curve is linear and flat. Now, I am pretty skeptical of the error term explanations. I'm happy to go on at extraordinary length on this, but my favorite is, at first, the vaccines were so effective that they were causing inflation in the first half of 2021, and then they lost their effectiveness, and that was what was causing inflation in the second half. We had goods prices being high, goods prices being low, energy going up, energy going down. With each one of these things, core inflation stayed about the same. A lot of the things people called supply shocks, I think, were really demand shocks. People talk about the Peloton economy, where people bought bikes instead of going to the gym. The big increase there happened in the spring of 2021 as people were actually returning to the gyms. You saw goods consumption and services consumption going up at the same time. So anyway, we can talk more about it if people want. Otherwise, I'll keep ranting. I think that in some sense, this was the wrong model, or the model was misapplied. So take 25% of GDP, and fiscal policy has long, variable, and possibly non-monotonic lags. These pictures are just to humor anyone from this room that wrote any of these papers. I'm not saying these are the right multipliers to use for this. I have no idea what multipliers one should use for this. But the point of this is these multipliers often last sort of 1, 2, 3 years, and they're not necessarily monotonic. So take 25% of GDP. Is the multiplier at T plus 1, 0.1? 0.1 times 25, I did the math earlier, it's 2.5% of GDP. It's really large. 0.2, that's 5% of GDP. Those are not crazy multipliers to have even at a horizon of 1, 2, 3 years ahead, and that the multiplier might go up, not down. So you can just get enormous things. And then there's the question of, can the economy absorb that in terms of real GDP, which is what was implicit in the models. This is what things looked like in December 2020. The blue line is just the IHS market forecast, but all the forecasts looked like this. The gray line is what CBO thought before the crisis. So I think you could think to yourself, in the best case, wouldn't it be miraculous if by the end of 2021, we get back to that gray line? We'd lost a lot of immigrants. We'd lost a lot of people. A lot of capital investment hadn't happened. There were a lot of disruptions. So I think even in some sense, the idea that you could get back to the gray line was almost like wishful thinking, optimistic, but not crazy. So now let's do the standard multipliers that CBO uses that we used to do at CEA. When you put that fiscal stimulus, and this is just the second half of it, by the way, you go up to that orange line. That orange line is way above the gray line. Just taking this and showing you the percentage change, this is what the multipliers would say GDP would be relative to the CBO forecast. And look, it has in Q2 and Q3 of 2021, 5% above the CBO forecast. So you're just coming out of COVID, and somehow you're going to get yourself from below the forecast to 5% above. So what could you have looked at when you looked at these multipliers and said, no, actually, there won't be inflation? One possibility is the multiplier is much lower. I think that was a reasonable thing to think ex ante, and it was true. But you need it to not just be lower upfront, you need it to stay lower. You need basically the person doesn't spend the transfer right away, and then it becomes wealth and they spend 3% of it a year for the rest of time. Not they sort of spend some of it this year, some of it next year, some of it the year after. Big expansion in productivity, or unemployment well below 3.5. If you looked at the IHS market and you look at the FOMC, you see they were projecting, FOMC being more important of the two, they were projecting output above pre-crisis trend, pre-crisis forecast, not just level, above the pre-crisis forecast. And they had the unemployment rate also higher than it was pre-crisis. In other words, they were implicitly assuming just a big burst of productivity, basically that supply was highly elastic. And if you want to buy stuff, you'll be able to buy it some which way, everything will come together. So here's what happened. This is the same picture, what you'd think from the multipliers. The diamonds are what happened to nominal GDP. The blue is where real GDP was relative to the forecast, and the orange is where prices were. So first of all, you didn't get those big multipliers. People didn't go out and spend their checks. Jonathan Parker, who claims to be watching this and email me later to confirm, found small multipliers. So you didn't get the big multipliers, but you get more stuff pushed out later. Is that the multiplier from this, the multiplier from 2020, the monetary policy, something else? The blue lines are sort of output is about as good as you could possibly expect. And then all the extra stuff goes into prices. Monetary policy was also highly asymmetric, and this was built right into the rules. It became about shortfalls, not deviations in the unemployment rate. I don't think that one ended up mattering, but that was built into it. The second was FATE basically said you should make up for low inflation, but not high inflation. It wasn't actually in their August 20 policy statement, but that's like the Torah, and people at the Fed have pointed me to the Talmud that interprets it, and they can point to where you find that interpretation. The really important one entered their statements in September of 2020, which is lift off only when you get to maximum employment, which literally said, you could be a 10th off, but on unemployment, 10 points off on inflation, and you still weren't supposed to lift off. That one they actually kept to. They did not raise rates until the unemployment rate was 3.5. The unemployment rate, even when it was 4, they weren't raising rates. Then they had this view that they made this mistake in the past of tightening because a forecast said inflation was coming. Never do that. We don't believe these forecasts. The models don't work. Wait till you see the whites of inflation's eyes was the basic operating principle. except you then do start believing forecasts if they tell you the inflation is going to go away. So you can use forecasts asymmetrically. And finally, you can cut rates quickly, but don't raise rates quickly. Now, that last one, they abandoned it to a greater degree than I could possibly have imagined, but it was still somewhat asymmetric. When I think about this, and this may only be relevant for this experience, I think the standard way that these models work is you have fiscal support through some multiplier goes to real GDP goes to employment goes to inflation. And then you could ask, do you have higher expected inflation, a nonlinear Phillips curve, speed effects, things like that? I think that's all just really hard to estimate, really unrobust. I've looked at papers that people do. I've tried to do it myself. I think in some ways, the model that was implicit in what I was saying was a little bit better for the past, which is just that our multipliers that we've looked at are about nominal GDP, not real GDP. And then there's something that tells you how much of that extra spending that people want to do is actual new stuff that's made, and how much of it is higher prices for that existing amount of stuff. And at some point, maybe even thinking of aggregate supply as inelastic is not terrible. So let me talk about where we are going forward. I think we're back in the world where everyone who thinks there's 2% inflation is relying on a model. And they're relying on a model that is really an edge case. Like if you take any parameter you could possibly put into something, there's a 40% chance that the thing that gets you 2 is right, but you need all three parameters to be that. And every one of them, almost all of the errors on the other side. So the model is inflation equals 2 minus something times the unemployment rate minus 3.5, supply shock. That 2, could it be some lag term because of some inertial process in inflation, which a lot of models generate? Could it be about short run expectations, which are still about 2 points above where they were before? Could expectations change and rise now that we're several years into this? The unemployment rate, if you added anything else like openings or quits, that would say that the economy is a lot tighter than it was before. And 3.5, I think there's many more estimates of a natural rate above that than below that. So I would say 2% is certainly possible, but it still is, and it might even be like a mode for each one of these pieces, but it's not the one I have. So what would I do now? We'll talk about it more on the panel. I'd put more of a burden on proof of a deviation from some sort of Taylor rule. They're still in the sort of 6.5. You have to be really dovish to get yourself to 5. I'd use fiscal policy 2. No one's going to do that, so I'll skip over the slide. This one I'm not sure about. On a blank slate, I would like a higher inflation target. I'm really worried about the costs of the transition to that. So I'd focus right now on reducing inflation. I would not go to a higher target until you're below 3. Once you're below 3, I think maybe you could. And finally, I will take 30 seconds more than I'm supposed to on the lessons for the future. The quantify stuff, this seems like tongue in cheek, but the number of times people said things, just random aside, they would say childcare is behind labor supply. It was a really easy thing to quantify how much childcare was on labor supply. And you could debate whether it was sort of 0.001 or 0.01. You couldn't get to 0.1 out of it, but people just said it over and over again. And when I say people, I'm talking about FOMC members. I think being a little bit pluralistic about models and not saying like this is the one true model or this is the one true set of parameters, often that's just going to spread you. Sometimes, though, it actually is quite skewed, and almost every story you can tell will either give you 2 or above 2, average across those, and you get a number higher than 2. I think being more symmetric, some of the Fed's asymmetries made sense, but not all of them collectively. Being closer to rules, I used to think dialing the things, the geniuses dialing them was a good idea because I'm a liberal and think government people know what they're doing. I'm less sure of that now. And don't fight the last war. What that means is constant updating. It became clear by the end of 2020 that things were less bad than we thought they were, and we should have updated towards more of a natural disaster and less of a financial crisis model. So all of that's easier said than done. If I'd had more time, I would have been more like humble and caveated, but you didn't give me the extra minute for that. So sorry.
So thanks for having me a lot. I had actually an intro, which is a bit of a reply to Kristin's intro, but I have a lot of things to do. So I'm going to say, because I have a lot of slides to cover. So I'm going to skip that to the answers. In some ways, I'm going to do something similar to Jason, which is I'm going to try to answer these 2 questions, which are the questions of the panels. And I'm basically going to spend the next 30 minutes struggling through it. And hopefully as I struggle through it, you'll struggle with me and we'll make some progress or something. So what's driving inflation? Question one. Skip it in your head. I'm not going to look back. I'm going to look at the present. What is driving inflation right now in 2023? Will it stay high, and what can policy do about it? First candidate, one that is very often heard. It's really all about relative prices. It's really striking when you look at not just the standard headline and core inflation, but you add to them one standard deviation of relative price across a roughly 200 PC categories, how there's been a dramatic increase in relative price variability. And moreover, much of it hasn't fallen at all. Therefore, if you say, well, inflation is really a pure part and a part that's really relative prices, the pure part being something having to do with the unit of account, you would say, well, maybe there isn't actually all that much inflation, or at least all of the inflation, not that there isn't much, there's not much pure inflation. It's really all about these relative prices. And an early version of this is, of course, the classic poor man's estimate of pure inflation, which is to look at core inflation that early on was lagging behind headline inflation. You take this view, which I think, again, a very often held view, and you answer the questions looking for what could drive relative prices. Ship, and Jason's picture, ships stuck in the harbor, pandemic, supply bottlenecks, Ukraine being some of them. But then if you go from this also to the second question, you say, well, the prices per person hasn't fallen at all. So if I want to bring inflation down, I have to bring the prices per person down. And you start talking about price controls or subsidies, because if it's a relative price problem, then you're going to go and attack relative prices. And little by little, you see this sipping through the discussion, certainly in Europe already, and inevitably somewhat here in the US. But let me be very skeptical. In a model with nominal rigidities, every shock is a relative price shock. If you have a monetary shock, some firms adjust, some don't. So what does it mean to say it's all relative prices? In the classic Calvo model you write or teach, every shock is a relative price shock. If you have elevated variance of monetary policy shocks, you're going to have exactly the picture that you saw here, to give an example. Moreover, if you go and, to illustrate this, move beyond the core inflation measure and try to say, well, let me really separate relatives from absolutes. And, it's a problem that I thought about a little bit about 15 years ago. And so let me give you an old model. There's better ones, but this one, I trust that I could run my computer and update it. Let's do the dynamic factor model I control for the equity proportional bits and the relative price bits. And you update it and do it now, and you do it in a bunch of different ways. And what myself and Mark had found 15 years ago is that, yeah, the pure inflation, the stuff that's uncorrelated relative prices, accounts maybe for 10% of price variability. Most of it is really relative prices. And lo and behold, at most, and with some standard errors, you can account for maybe 1% increase in inflation on account of this pure part. Most of it is relative prices. And this is true now as well. And what do I learn from this about inflation is high? Not very much. Moreover, as an economist, I'm supposed to solve for prices, not to say that I explain why prices went up by saying prices went up, or because relative prices was. Now, at best, you can make a little bit of progress and say, look, let me focus on one very notable, well-identified relative price, oil prices. That I kind of can understand what that is. And however, if you do that, you have to remind yourself that for sure, oil price increases were not driven just when Putin invaded Ukraine. After all, they were pretty high already a few months earlier on account of the very fast global recovery. And if you do the work of isolating what was really a supply shock, here I'm just going to put a picture from a paper by Lutz, Kilian, and Zhu trying to isolate the supply shock. You end up with something that actually is very prevalent if you look at impulse response versus oil price shocks, is that they can explain a quarter or two of elevated inflation and nothing left within 3 or 4 quarters. So when I go with my first question, how much does this explain 2023 inflation, the oil price? The answer is not very much. And what can policy do about it, therefore? Maybe not all that much. A second candidate, and again, one that was very, very often used in debates, is it's all supply. Now, as a macroeconomist, I always struggled with that word because being a well-raised and general equilibrium trained, I know there's technologies, there's preferences, there's markets. What the heck is supply and demand? But I tend to think about, well, supply is the optimality conditions coming from the firms, demand is the optimality conditions coming from the consumers, and then it becomes very hard to understand what's supply and demand in a scenario of the last 2 years. But luckily, there's a very clever answer produced by a wonderful economist at the San Francisco Fed, Adam Shapiro, which has been extremely influential, especially it shows up in Philip Lane's ECB debates, ECB speeches almost every time, which say, look, let's look at inflation and separate the sectors for which prices went up and quantity went up. Let's look at the sectors where prices went up and quantity went down. The latter are supply. We split inflation. It's an arithmetic decomposition. And one is demand and the other is supply. If you do that answer, you end up with a lot of supply-driven inflation. And again, I think this is probably the cleverest way of doing it and a really, I hope, influential, I think, not just in policy, but in research. And you end up absolving, but the conclusion is you absolve monetary policy from the current inflation high, because after all, supply is not the monetary policy is demand. And second, you end up with discussions that say, well, let's not bring inflation down very quickly. Recall your optimal targeting rules. If it's a supply shock, you're supposed to trade it. If you try to bring inflation far too quickly now, you end up with a very big recession because it's a supply shock. And again, you see many versions, I think, of this. I see a few Fed economists shaking their heads. So I think they have seen, I think, versions of this. Again, though, let's think about this a little bit more. I put a lot of equations here just for completeness, but you don't have to absorb all of them. Think about the textbook New Keynesian model with two sectors. All I'm going to do is just put two sectors in it, okay? There's just two sectors, but I'm going to have the following three forms of heterogeneity across those two sectors. One, when a technology shock hits, it may have a bigger incidence one sector rather than the other. It's perfectly plausible not to assume that these are perfectly neutral. Second, when the government goes and spends stuff, it may end up spending more in one sector as opposed to another one. Seems also perfectly plausible. And thirdly, that some sectors have stickier prices than others in terms of the extent of nominal rigidities. Those are all the equations together with a nominal income monetary policy so that I can keep everything static in pencil and paper, so that hopefully you don't completely distrust me when I say that the answers of this is, when will I have, according to the composition, that it is a supply shock, meaning that sector B prices go up, but quantity goes down, even as sector A goes up and down? And the answer is very easily. Actually, if I have a positive monetary supply shock, what happens is, if it turns out that one of the sectors is much more price elastic than the other, the one that has the very sticky prices is going to be the one that expands production, but then because it's going to absorb labor from the other sector goes down. If I have positive government purchases, I buy a lot from Valerie stuff, I don't buy from Marty. Again, she draws labor, Marty goes down, even though this is a positive demand shock, I would say. And even if it's a technology shock, likewise, you get that I can easily have a positive technology shock on both, but one of the sectors goes down and the other one goes up. I can get any decomposition of supply and demand for any of these three shocks. Or if you want, a more general lesson that aggregate demand is not the aggregation of demands. And there's no link between fundamental shocks and what is aggregate demand or supply. Third candidate, one that's very dear to my heart, it's expectations. And that comes in many ways from a Phillips curve view of the world, one that I hold very dearly since I'm the Phillips professor. I was being interviewed by I know now the entire biography of Phillips. I'm always being asked about Phillips. How much of the inflation, I can tell you all kinds of stories about Mr. Phillips. How much of the inflation associated with, as a wonderful composition, how much, and you saw Jason using it just now, 10 minutes ago, how much is tightness and activity? How much is expectations? How much is supply shocks? Supply shocks are shifts in the curve. Let's not use the word supply. Okay. It's a various organizing framework, and the optimal New Keynesian policy, again, makes really a crucial decomposition between what's credibility, what's being offset, and what's not. And to look at this, again, the first answer is, and these are pictures that I was showing a couple of years ago, you answer that, look, there was a real shift of expectations to the right. You want to look at distributions because the medians on these household surveys are very slow, and so distributions really give you more. And you say, look, a lot of the inflation was indeed this shift in expectations, some bad policy, some bad luck. But you also end up, and this is a compliment, instead of looking at the surveys, let's look at some work that I've been doing the last year. Let me look at options on inflation so that you get also a sense from financial markets. And both this, if you pay attention here to the gray line, which is one of the more recent ones, the two more recent ones in the surveys, or the markets, this one, what you see in the last 9 months is an amazing re-anchoring, a huge success of monetary policy or luck, in that expectations have really shifted back left in an extremely decisive way. A big win from talking tough, acting tough or not, and you end up with some optimism. Policy advice, their second answer, stay on the course, be patient, it's really paying off. You've really re-anchored the expectations. But let me be again a little bit, scratch my head. On the one hand, I love this answer. I've been doing these pictures. But let me scratch my expectations. I mean, expectations are as endogenous as it gets, right? I love them because they're a useful signal, but they don't answer the question Marty and Valerie asked. And so what's the driver of inflation? Simplest model of inflation, a Fisher equation, a central bank that's trying to pick what's the interest rate with some gap, with some estimate of it, and so there's some error. and does so by following a Taylor rule of the coefficient phi. Imagine that a share of agents have rational expectations, whereas the remainder, they expect the inflation target plus some random noise. Simple enough that, again, hopefully you can trust me when the solution is this. So just combine these. Inflation is on target and deviates from target when the central bank misevaluates the state of the economy, when agents start expecting stuff and that drives inflation, and when you lose credibility in the sense of the speculative hyperinflation last term. What this says is that to understand why inflation is high today, absolutely understanding erratic expectations is important. Animal spirits, Keynesianism if you want. And to understand whether you've lost credibility, long expectations can be very important. Expectations are really important to understand inflation. But without those two, actual expected pi t plus 1 in this model is completely useless because it's IID, no. In other words, when I look at these plots, I think they're wonderful as signals, but they don't really tell me if any of these are driving the expected inflation, which is what, again, they asked me to do. So let me move to what I think is a slightly better approach, and a better approach because I think it's an approach that I learned from coming to these meetings for about 20 years. And that is, let me think instead of shocks. We had two really big shocks from the Biden administration from the beginning, the Inflation Recovery Act and the stimulus or the COVID Recovery Act. And I'm going to treat what the CBO said as the news, fiscal news, and compare them to Valerie's military spending news. Now, I'm going to overstate it because I'm going to say they're all news, but I'm also going to understate it because the Biden administration says that the second stimulus, the IRA, costs nothing because it's going to pay for itself within like 2 years immediately. So that's why it's so small in some ways. And I was like, this is really promising because it's very large in the last 40 years. To be clear, it's not that promising because, by the way, things used to be much bigger, as Valerie will tell you. But still, hey, it's significant in the last few years. Now, if I have shocks, what can I do? I can use the VARs that Valerie, classic textbook VAR, the ones estimated by Valerie, with some slight estimates, plug in that shock series, how much inflation could they generate? And the answer is very little. Now, maybe say Valerie kind of is in the low multiplier camp. Yeah, fine, multiply this by 2 or 3. You end up is that may have generated inflation 2021, 22, but by 23, there's just very little inflation coming from here. So one, doesn't seem like this is the answer. And that austerity, the thing that Jason ruled out, is not the recipe to bring inflation down, seems right. But then we get to monetary policy. What's that? They ruled it out. Okay, good point. You're right. Thank you. Monetary policy. Well, let me back out deviations from the Taylor rule. Given now, deviation of the rule depends on what Taylor rule you use. A baseline, do you do some interest rate smoothing, so do some others? But you know, some pretty big monetary policy shocks. Basically, what Jason was pointing, that policy was pretty loose. Objection, of course, using a Taylor rule. Taylor rules are mechanical policies for backward looking. But if you plug in those shocks, and again, at least I'm tying my hands, into another wonderful VAR, the one estimated by Marty and company, textbook VARs, just to make sure that I'm sure there's better VARs, although Marty will maybe say no or yes, but you know, some VARs. And then you can explain why in 2023, inflation is, again, depending on which of the shock series, is somewhere around the labels got missed. This is not a 4.0. 4.0 is there. Sorry, never mind. But somewhere between 1% and 4% above where it should be, and that it's coming down slowly. In other words, that a lot of the raising core inflation is explained by loose monetary policy, and looking forward that normalization is about to have starting effects, a word of optimism, as long as you stay on course, and if you want it faster, go a little faster like Jason suggested. You can do this instead with a VAR to forecast the shocks of the Taylor rule, but I don't have time, but just to say that you end up with actually very similar conclusions in terms of qualitatively, if not quantitative. So to conclude, what's driving inflation? Will it stay high? We've had large and persistent relative dispersion. We've had output in some sectors booming and others contracting. We have expectations getting out of hand and re-anchoring. And these are all really interesting, really useful, very good to understand inflation dynamics and their consequences. But they, I don't think, answer the two questions above. One thing that answers it is using VARs. If so, fiscal policy turns out not to be much, but monetary policy is perhaps the greatest culprit for why we have inflation high today. But also a word of optimism in that it's about to come down very quickly if I'm going to trust the VARs estimated. Of course, another answer for which I neither had the time nor the energy is together with VARs, do the other thing I've learned in this room for 20 years, which would be write a DSG model. We're going to see one tomorrow, and try to answer again answers of this type. But this is perhaps a more fruitful approach to try and understand to what extent inflation, where it is and where it's coming down. The one I did, I think there's some reason, at least for optimism, but at least open the debate in a different sense. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Valerie, Marty, and Eric, for having me. It's great to be here in Cambridge discussing this very crucial issue facing monetary and macroeconomics. So I'd like to make 3 points. First, on why has inflation returned? Picking up on some of the points Jason made and Ricardo as well. Let me see if this works. No. Okay, very good. And then it should work. Okay, excellent. So there are many striking similarities in the inflation experience across different regions, but there are also some very important differences, which I'd like to discuss, especially from my perspective as a policymaker in the UK, because those differences are relevant for what to do about it. Second, with elevated inflationary pressures, almost all central banks have tightened policy very sharply. But third, at least in the UK, the shape of the inflationary shock stemming mostly from the large increase in energy prices, coupled with the long lags with which monetary policy affects the economy, means that the most likely scenario now is that we undershoot the inflation target in the medium term, meaning 2025. So starting with why inflation increased and the differences across regions, we know well the series of shocks that have driven up inflation all over the world. First, the pandemic with its effects on supply, coupled with the fiscal response and the effect of the recovery on demand and the rotation of demand. And then followed almost immediately by shocks to energy and other commodity prices caused by the war in Ukraine. But while the US, the UK, and the Euro area have all faced very high inflation, the drivers, the quantitative drivers of that inflation have differed across jurisdictions. In the case of the UK and the Euro area, the main driver of above target inflation has been the extraordinary increase in energy prices. In the US, stronger domestic demand has played a bigger role in driving inflationary pressures. And to a large extent, that strong US demand shock appeared as an additional cost push shock in the UK, as that led to higher imported goods prices. Now, a simple way to see this is to look at the terms of trade, which measure the prices of the goods and services a country exports relative to those it imports. And as you can see here, over 2021 and 2022, the US terms of trade improved, whereas the terms of trade of the UK and the Euro area worsened materially. This again was caused mainly by energy prices and the fact that the US didn't see such a large increase in gas prices. And ultimately, the US is a net exporter of energy and other commodities, whereas the UK and the Euro area are net importers. This chart stops at the end of 2022, but we now know that energy prices have fallen back. And so much of this movement, as well as most of its effects, will start unwinding. But in the data we have, the terms of trade patterns are also reflected in the evolution of real consumption, which is illustrated here. And in the US, as Jason showed, consumption recovered very, very quickly from the pandemic. In fact, it reached its pre-pandemic level early in 2021 and caught up with the pre-COVID trend by the middle of 2021. And indeed overtook that trend. Meanwhile, in the Euro area, consumption has remained well below the pre-COVID trend and only just returned to its pre-COVID level recently. And finally, we have the UK, where we see consumption is, at the end of last year, was not even back to its pre-COVID level and remains more than 10% below its pre-COVID trend. So while we can debate the role of strong demand in the US, it's difficult to make the case that inflation in the UK has been driven by a demand boom, as some people have thought. So on the why, I would say the quantitative split of these drivers is clearly different across these economies, and an enormous cost push shock by many metrics, much bigger than the one we saw in the 70s, played a major role in the UK and the European inflation dynamics. But on what to do about it, one response could be that energy price movements are changes in relative prices, so monetary policy can always ensure that aggregate inflation meets the target. And in the medium term, that's absolutely true. And I don't think anyone in this room will disagree. But we're not, by mandate, not strict inflation targeters. We have flexible inflation targeting frameworks. In the UK in particular, the remit is clear that we are not intended to keep inflation at 2% irrespective of the circumstances. Shocks will always move inflation away from the target, and the role of monetary policy is to bring inflation back to target in the medium term. And again, we think of horizons of 2 to 3 years at a speed that gives consideration to output and employment volatility. And this simple diagram here shows or summarizes how we can operationalize those flexible inflation targeting mandates. The appropriate monetary policy response to an energy price shock is not automatic. Increases in energy prices can have several different effects that can push inflation in different directions at different horizons, as illustrated here. So we have direct effects from energy enter directly in the CPI through petrol prices, energy and utility bills, and so on. And we have indirect effects, that's my point too here, through firms' input costs, as energy is an important input in the production of many goods and services, including those entering in the core basket. These two channels were the main drivers of the quick drive up in inflation. But since monetary policy, again, operates with a lag, responding to what have proved already to be a temporary increase in specific prices would have added to inflation volatility rather than reduce it. Instead, we need to always focus on the medium term. And these are the two last channels that I stress here, inertia and lower real incomes in the case of net importers of energy. So inertia arises from different forms of implicit or explicit indexation, and just because headline inflation is the main reference point for contract or wage negotiations. And obviously inertia will slow down the return of domestic wages and prices to target, particularly in the context of a tight labor market. But again, because the UK is a net importer of energy, this has to be balanced against the disinflationary effects of lower real incomes and lower real wealth. Although energy prices have now fallen back quite substantially, the shock has still made the UK poorer. And in response, lower real incomes have weighed heavily on demand over the past year, especially for hand-to-mouth consumers, ultimately reducing consumption and inflationary pressures in the medium term. Now, as we know, in response to these developments, well, in the case of the UK monetary policy, we have put more weight on that inertia, and we tighten sharply, materially as in many other countries. This has been, by the way, the fastest tightening in the history of the Monetary Policy Committee. And this chart gives a sense of that speed. It shows 5-year nominal interest rates in the US, the Euro area, and the UK. Now, while the paths have different somewhat, we see a significant tightening in all three regions. Now, so far, this has had a very small dampening effect on inflation, which might lead us to ask whether policy should do more, and that's the question. And of course, policymakers would always stand ready to do more if these inflationary pressures start building again. And we need to keep an eye on those drivers that we discussed. But given monetary policy lags, policy needs to be based on forward-looking forecasts. And those forecasts, at least for the UK, are telling us that we may already have tightened too much. So to illustrate these points, this chart shows the overall shape of UK quarterly CPI inflation, annual. This is coming from our most recent forecasts, which were made in February, so they don't capture the latest data. But unsurprisingly, given the very fast run-up in energy prices, this profile is incredibly steep. So we go from inflation at the 2% target in the middle of 2021 to a quarterly peak of 10.7% 6 quarters after that, and then falling back to 1% below our target 6 quarters after that. So those, again, these forecasts are simply telling us what's happening with the big level increase in energy prices coming out of the inflation calculation, the annual inflation calculation. Energy prices and other commodity prices that also increased remarkably during this period. So then the steepness of the profile actually probably downplays what we might now expect, because since February, gas prices have fallen even more. Now, obviously, we couldn't have known about the war in Ukraine back in 2021, and that was, one reason for the big errors. But even if we somehow did, let me illustrate my points on policy lags by showing you what would have happened if we had tightened a lot more, a lot earlier. And so here, I layer on into this mountain of inflation the shape of a typical monetary policy response and its effects to inflation, taken from one of our latest forecasts. I have scaled the effect to show what would have happened if we had increased bank rate by about 5 percentage points more to around 8%, starting in the middle of 2021. So this is still pandemic period. This, by the way, also happens to be the same amount of cumulative tightening that you would obtain with the Taylor rule that just puts weight on current inflation deviations from the target. And a weight of 1.5. Oh, okay. So you can see that despite this raise in interest rates by far more, the benefits are relatively small. Inflation peaks slightly lower, but still well above targets. And there are costs to this, which we need to consider given the rest of our mandate. Unemployment would have increased by 3 percentage points higher. But most crucially, given our remit is to achieve the inflation target in the medium term, the sharp tightening that is already in place leads to an undershoot by 2024. That's the end of the purple mountain. With a larger tightening, that outlook would be even worse, with inflation set to turn negative in the medium term. So that's that would be the difference between these two lines. We would end in deflationary territory if we had done this extra Taylor rule policy. Now, what if we had known about the war in Ukraine and we had tried to offset all of the impact of the war and get inflation at the 2% target in 2022? Well, this is the exercise that's it. And I don't want to take it too seriously, because obviously I'm raising rates to 30% here in order to achieve that. That's how much you would have had to, and we can discuss. But clearly the economic cost would have been enormous, even putting those aside, the medium-term inflation implications from that would have been a disaster in terms of meeting our targets. And you could argue also about our credibility if we end up with this picture. So let me just conclude. As other countries, although differently from the US, inflation in the UK has been caused largely by a negative terms of trade shock. Energy has played a huge role. What to do about it? The appropriate policy response can differ across countries, and this has to be considered. And obviously, this assessment matters now when, given the shape of the shock and the lags before monetary policy can have an impact on inflation, we need to ask what policy, whether policy has already over-tightened. And finally, I want to remind everyone about Milton Friedman's analogy with the fool in the shower. When the fool starts the water and it runs cold, it keeps turning the faucet, and eventually, because he's impatient, gets burned.